Roland Cross didn't knock. He never did. He pushed through the door of the Cross Ranch house like he owned it, because in his mind he already did. Evelyn was still in her work clothes, dried mud on her boots, the lease papers spread across the kitchen table. He looked at those papers the way a man looks at something that belongs to him and has been borrowed too long. "You've got until sundown," he said. "Sign them over, or I go to the board myself and tell them what everyone already knows, that you can't run this place and never could." Evelyn didn't answer right away. She looked at her dead husband's brother standing in her kitchen, and she thought Thomas would be sick. "Get out of my house, Roland." He smiled. That was the worst part. The smile. "It's not your house much longer. But if you've ever had someone try to take what's yours while they're still smiling at you, you already know what Evelyn Cross felt in that moment. If you haven't, count yourself lucky." This is the story of a woman who had everything stripped down to nothing and what she chose to do about it. Stay with us until the end. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. The morning Roland walked into her kitchen, Evelyn Cross had been awake since 4. She hadn't slept well in the 11 months since Thomas died, and she'd stopped pretending otherwise. Sleep was a thing that happened to people who weren't carrying a ranch alone. She rose before the light, made coffee she barely tasted, and stood at the window watching the dark shapes of the barn and the pasture fence and the water tank that needed its valve replaced. Had needed it since September, when Thomas was already too sick to climb up there and she was too busy keeping him comfortable to do it herself. 11 months. Not long enough to stop reaching for him in the night. Long enough for everything else to start falling apart. The Cross Ranch sat on 412 acres in the Lander Valley, southeast of the Bitterroot Range, the kind of country that ate soft people for breakfast and didn't apologize for it. Thomas's grandfather had filed on the original homestead in 1891. His father had added the south pasture in 1923. Thomas himself had negotiated the current lease extension with the Valley Board in 1954, 2 years before he got the diagnosis that would take him by the following December. He'd spent his last good months teaching Evelyn everything he could: water rights, lease terms, grazing rotation, the names of the board members and which ones could be reasoned with and which ones needed to see numbers on paper. He'd taught her how to read the cattle weights and when to call the vet, and how to talk to ranch hands who'd grown up thinking women belonged indoors. What he hadn't taught her, so what nobody had taught her, was how to fight his own brother. She'd known Roland Cross for 17 years since before the wedding. She'd always found him difficult in the way that certain men are difficult. Full of opinions about how other people should run their lives, quick to offer help that came attached to something you didn't want. When Thomas was alive, Roland had kept himself at a manageable distance. He came to dinners. He offered advice nobody asked for. He smiled with his mouth while his eyes stayed busy, calculating. After Thomas died, the distance evaporated. He'd shown up at the funeral in his good suit and stood at the graveside with an expression Evelyn had catalogued somewhere between grief and satisfaction. He'd helped carry the casket. He'd shaken hands with the neighbors and accepted their condolences as though they were partly his. And 3 weeks later, he'd come to her kitchen table with a document drafted by an attorney in Billings and told her it was the simplest solution for everyone involved. The document proposed transferring operational control of the Cross Ranch to Roland, with Evelyn retaining residential rights and a modest monthly allowance. "You'd be taken care of," he'd said. That's what Thomas would have wanted. She'd asked him to leave. He'd left, but the document stayed on the table for a long moment before he picked it back up, and the way he did it, slowly, carefully, like a man who knew he'd be back, told her everything she needed to understand about what was coming. That had been 9 months ago. Since then, Roland had worked the valley the way water works stone, steadily, without hurry, finding every small crack and pressing into it. He'd gone to the lease board with questions, not accusations, just questions. Whether the widow had the experience to manage a property this size, whether the grazing allotment was being properly maintained, whether the board had a responsibility to consider the long-term stewardship of the valley's water resources, given that the Cross South pasture shared a drainage with the Kellerman and Pruitt properties. He'd gone to the feed store and talked to men Evelyn depended on, planting small doubts the way you plant seeds, quietly, without ceremony, with the patience of someone who knows spring always comes. He'd attended the community meeting in March and raised his hand and asked, in that careful voice of his, whether it might be prudent for the lease board to conduct a site review of the Cross property before the June renewal, just to ensure everything was in order, just to be thorough. Nobody had objected. Nobody had defended her either. That was the part that hurt in a way Roland's open contempt never quite managed to. Not the enemy across the table, but the neighbors who'd known Thomas Cross for 30 years, who'd sat at this same kitchen table, who'd helped brand calves and pull fence and bring food when Thomas was dying. Those neighbors going quiet, looking at the floor, choosing not to make an enemy of Roland Cross, because Roland Cross was still going to be here, and Evelyn might not be. She understood it. She didn't forgive it, but she understood it. She poured the last of her coffee down the drain and went out to start the day. The hands she had left were two: Curtis Webb, who was 54 and had worked the ranch since Thomas's father's time, and a young man named Pell who'd come on in February and stayed mostly because he had nowhere else to go. Good workers, both of them. Not enough. She'd started the season with 5. One had quit in April when a better offer came from the Morrison spread. 2 more had left in May within 2 weeks of each other, both citing the same reason. They'd heard the Cross lease might not renew and they couldn't risk being stranded without work come summer. Evelyn had known, the moment she heard their explanations, exactly where those rumors had originated. Roland hadn't needed to fire anyone. He'd just made it known, quietly, in the feed store and the diner and the barber shop, that the Cross Ranch was uncertain, that the widow was in over her head, that the lease board had concerns. Uncertainty was enough. Uncertainty made men look for other jobs. She was in the south pasture checking the fence line when Curtis came out to find her. He had his hat in his hands, which was a thing he only did when the news was bad. 14 calves short, he said. I went through the count twice. She stood with the fence post in one hand and looked at him. 14. Might be more. Some of the tags are hard to read on the younger ones. They'd been short before. 3 in February, 2 in March. Losses that fit within the range of what ranches lost. But 14 at once was different. 14 was a crisis. 14 was exactly the kind of thing that got brought up at lease board hearings. Mountain lions? Curtis shook his head. He was looking at the fence line, not at her. No carcasses, no blood, no tracks I could find. Someone took them. That'd be my read. She didn't say Roland's name. She didn't need to. Curtis had worked for Thomas Cross for 26 years. He knew who was circling. All right, she said. We ride the boundary, every foot of it. I want to know where they went out. They rode for 3 hours and found nothing. No breaks in the fence, no tire tracks on the access road. No signs of a forced crossing anywhere along the east boundary that faced the Kellerman property or the north boundary that abutted the county road. The calves had simply disappeared, which was impossible, which meant she was missing something. She was in the barn working through it when the sound of wagon wheels reached her. She came outside and saw an outfit she didn't recognize coming up the main track. A battered wagon pulled by 2 horses that had seen better years, and on the bench a man she'd never laid eyes on. Lean, weathered, somewhere in his late 30s or early 40s, wearing clothes that had been mended more than once. Beside him on the bench sat a small girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, black-haired and watchful, with the kind of stillness in her face that you didn't usually see in children that age. The man pulled up in the yard and climbed down without hurry. He had a way of moving, deliberate, unhurried, that Evelyn clocked immediately as something more than laziness. It was the movement of someone who had learned not to waste effort, which was different from someone who'd never learned to work. Elias Boone, he said, and extended a hand. I'm looking for work if you've got it. Evelyn looked at the hand, then at the man, then at the girl still sitting on the wagon bench with her hands folded in her lap. Who's the child? My daughter, Lark. He said it without apology or explanation, which she appreciated. She goes where I go. Can she talk? She chooses not to, mostly. He said it the same way. No apology, no embarrassment, a fact, like the weather. Evelyn looked at the girl. Lark looked back at her with dark, level eyes that were doing something Evelyn recognized, cataloging, taking things in. The same thing Evelyn herself did when she walked into a room full of people who'd already decided what they thought of her. Where have you been working? Montana, last 2 years. Before that, Wyoming. Before that, I'd rather not say. He held her gaze when he said the last part, which she noted. Most men looked away when they were hiding something. He'd said it straight, which meant he knew exactly what he was hiding and had decided she deserved to know it was there, even if she didn't get to know what it was. She stood in the yard and thought about Curtis and Pell and 14 missing calves and the lease hearing 6 weeks away. I can't pay what you're worth, she said. I'll tell you that plain. I didn't ask what you can pay. 40 a month and found. The bunkhouse has 2 rooms. You and the girl can take the smaller one. He nodded. No negotiation, no gratitude. Acceptance, which was what she needed. She started to turn back to the barn, then stopped. Mr. Boone, how'd you find this place? He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a small piece of wood. A cedar chip, maybe 2 inches across. One edge scorched black from fire. He held it out to her and she took it, turned it over. On the smooth side, someone had carved a small mark. She'd seen that mark before. It was the Cross brand, her brand, a crosshatch design Thomas's grandfather had registered in 1892. Found it on the road, Elias said, about 3 miles east, near the old fence line. She stared at the chip. Why'd you bring it to me? Seemed like you'd want to know where it came from. He looked at her steadily. I figured wherever this came from, there was a story behind it, and I was looking for work in the right direction. She looked at the chip again, at the brand mark, at the scorched edge that meant someone had tried to burn it but not quite managed. Then she looked at the man. He wasn't asking her to trust him. He was showing her something and letting her decide. You start Monday, she said. She was still holding the cedar chip when Roland's truck appeared at the end of the main track. She heard it before she saw it. That particular engine sound she'd learned to dread, the same truck he'd been driving since 1949, black with a chrome grille that needed work. He came fast and stopped hard in the yard, the way he'd been doing lately, like each arrival was supposed to be an event. Elias hadn't moved from where he stood. The girl lark watched the truck without turning her head, just shifting her eyes. Roland stepped out and looked at Elias and then at Evelyn. Who's this? My new hand. You hired someone without talking to me first? I don't talk to you about my ranch, Roland. The thing about Roland Cross was that he was not a stupid man. He was, in fact, quite clever, and the cleverness made him more dangerous than a simple bully would have been. He looked at Evelyn, then at Elias, and calculated something quickly behind his eyes, and then he smiled. I came to tell you that I've spoken to Harlan Pruitt at the board. They've moved the hearing up. She went still. To when? Week from Friday. That was 2 weeks earlier than the scheduled date. 2 weeks she didn't have. They can't do that without notifying me. Notice went out this morning. Should arrive at your mailbox tomorrow. He glanced around the yard with an expression of careful concern, the look of a man surveying damage. Evelyn, I'm trying to help you. You have to see that. Let me come in with a proposal before that hearing and we can settle this the right way. You don't have to fight a battle you can't win. She thought about the cedar chip in her hand. She closed her fingers around it. You need to leave my property, Roland. I'm family. You're on my land without an invitation. Leave. Something moved in his face. Not anger, not quite. Something colder. The calculation shifting to a longer timetable. I'll be at the hearing, he said. I'll be there to tell them what I've seen out here. The fence condition, the short count, the fact that you're hiring drifters you've never met. He didn't look at Elias again. I hope you'll think hard between now and then. He got back in the truck. He drove out slowly this time, which was worse than if he'd gone fast. The slowness said, I'm not worried. I have time. Evelyn stood in the yard after the truck disappeared. Elias was quiet beside her. Curtis had come out of the barn at some point during the exchange and stood a little distance off, watching. That's the man trying to take the ranch, she said. She said it to the air, not to anyone in particular. I got that impression, Elias said. She opened her hand and looked at the burned cedar chip again. The Cross brand. 3 miles east, near the old fence line that nobody had reason to use anymore because the east boundary hadn't been grazed in 2 seasons. Monday's too long, she said. You start today. She put the chip in her pocket and walked toward the barn. Behind her, she heard the wagon creak as Elias began to unhitch his horses, moving with that same deliberate, unhurried efficiency. Like a man who understood that the work in front of him would take time and didn't see the point in pretending otherwise. The girl lark climbed down from the bench and stood in the yard. She was looking east, in the direction Roland's truck had gone, not watching it go. Looking past it, at the hills beyond the fence line, with that cataloging expression. Evelyn stopped in the barn doorway. The child turned and looked at her with those dark, level eyes. "What do you see?" Evelyn asked. Lark didn't answer. She reached into the pocket of her dress and brought out something small, a stub of red wax crayon, the tip worn flat. She held it up, then pointed east. Red. The color used on branding tools, the color you'd see if someone was rebranding cattle in a hurry, somewhere out of sight. Evelyn stood in the doorway a long moment, looking at the child. "Curtis?" she called. He appeared in the barn behind her. "What's the last time anyone rode the East Canyon pasture?" He thought about it. 2 seasons. Maybe more. Why? Thomas shut it down. Said the canyon fence needed work before we put animals in there. Did he do the work? Curtis's face shifted slightly. No, he got sick before that. She looked at the burned cedar chip in her hand. She looked at Lark's red crayon. She thought about 14 calves that had disappeared without a single carcass, without a single track in or out of the west boundary fence. "Saddle my horse," she said. "It's going on 5 o'clock. Then I won't have much daylight. Saddle my horse." She went to the East Canyon pasture with Curtis and Pell and Elias, who came without being asked and without explaining why, like a man who'd already decided what he was doing and didn't require a conversation about it. The girl lark stayed behind in the yard, but Evelyn had the feeling she was being watched all the way to the tree line. The East Canyon was steep and brushy, cut through by a dry creek bed that ran in spring and baked hard by June. Nobody had worked cattle in there for 2 years, and it showed. The grass was overgrown, the fence posts weathered, the cattle trail grown over. But as they pushed deeper in, Evelyn began to notice things. The grass near the creek bed was shorter than the grass around it, shorter the way grass gets when animals have been grazing it. Curtis noticed it too. She could see it in the set of his shoulders. They reached the south wall of the canyon where the land rose into a broken escarpment, and there, in the failing light, behind a screen of juniper and scrub pine that she'd ridden past a dozen times without looking twice, she saw a section of fence that wasn't old fence. New posts, new wire, a gate you'd never find unless you knew to look. She got down off her horse and went to it. The gate was padlocked, but through the gap at the bottom of the fence, where the wire didn't quite reach the ground, she could see hoof prints in the soft soil. Fresh ones. And she could hear, not far beyond the screen of trees, the sound of calves calling. She stood at that gate in the last hour of daylight, and the anger that moved through her wasn't hot and sudden. It was something deeper and slower, the kind of anger that comes when you understand not just what someone has done to you, but how long they've been doing it, and how carefully they've worked to make sure you couldn't see. This hadn't started when Thomas died. This had started before. She stepped back and looked at the padlock, and then at Elias. He was looking at the gate with no expression in particular, but his eyes were doing what they'd been doing all evening, collecting, categorizing, noting. "Can you open that?" she said. He looked at her, looked at the lock. "Probably. Take me a minute." "Then take your minute," she said. "We're going in." The darkness was coming down fast. She could hear the calves beyond the tree line, and beneath the anger there was something she hadn't expected, a rush of strange relief, because cattle that were hidden were cattle that were still alive. And cattle that were still alive meant Roland had made a mistake. He'd kept them. He'd been greedy and careful at the same time. And careful men who are also greedy make mistakes, because patience and greed don't ride well together for long. She heard the lock give. Elias held the gate open and looked at her. She walked through. It was dark by the time they got back to the ranch. She didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table where Thomas had taught her water rights and lease terms, and she worked through what she knew, writing it out in her steady hand on the back of an old bill of lading because it was the only paper she had handy. 22 calves, all bearing fresh brands over older marks. The older marks, the ones you could see if you looked closely at the edges, where the branding iron hadn't quite covered the original, were the Cross brand. Her brand. 6 weeks ago, that gate had been put in. She was sure of it. Maybe sooner, but not much. Which meant the calves hadn't been taken all at once. They'd been taken in small groups, quietly, over time, fed in the canyon pasture where they couldn't be seen and couldn't be heard from the normal working areas of the ranch. 14 short in this week's count. But the others might be going back months. The March losses, maybe the February losses. She'd thought mountain lion. She'd thought disease. She'd thought a dozen things that were simpler and less terrible than the truth. She thought about the burned cedar chip, about where it had been found, 3 miles east near the old fence line. Someone carrying it from the canyon pasture or dropping it while they worked, and the wind or water or simple chance carrying it to the road. She thought about Lark with her red crayon. The child had known. Not the details, but she'd known something, noticed something that afternoon when Roland drove out and looked east past the truck. Noticed what direction the thing was. Evelyn sat at the table for a long time. Then she got up, filled the coffee pot, and started working out what she needed to do before the hearing. She had a week and a half. She had 22 calves behind a gate in the East Canyon with Roland's fresh brand over her old one. She had a burned cedar chip with her grandfather-in-law's registered mark on it. She had a man she'd known for approximately 6 hours, his silent daughter, and 2 ranch hands who'd been loyal enough to stay. What she didn't have was proof that Roland had put those calves there. Not the kind of proof a board would accept over the word of a cross man with 17 years of standing in the valley. She would need witnesses. She would need the board to come out to that canyon and see with their own eyes. She would need to move before Roland noticed the gate had been opened and moved the calves somewhere else. She wrote that down too. Then she picked up the burned cedar chip from where she'd set it on the table and held it for a moment. Thomas had always said, "You don't fight a man by arguing with him. You fight him by showing people what he is." She set the chip down and kept writing. Outside, the ranch was dark and quiet. The new hand's light was still on in the bunkhouse. She could see it through the kitchen window. A faint yellow square in all that dark. She wondered what he'd been hiding, the part he'd said he'd rather not say. She wondered about the road he'd been on, and what he'd been running from or toward, and whether it mattered. Then she decided it didn't matter. Not right now. Right now what mattered was what he'd done. Walked up her track and handed her a piece of wood with her own brand on it, and let her decide what to do about it. She could work with a man who did that. She could figure out the rest later. She wrote until the coffee was gone, and then she kept writing. She didn't sleep that night, but by morning she had a list. It wasn't a long list, which was the problem. The people she could count on, genuinely count on, not the people who'd smile at her face and go quiet at the feed store, fit on half a page. Curtis. Pell. Her neighbor May Dunbar 2 miles south, who'd been bringing casseroles since January and hadn't asked anything in return. The hardware man in town, Gus Freeling, who'd extended her credit twice without discussion. Maybe the land surveyor, Walt Odom, who'd done survey work for Thomas and had a reputation for not being anybody's man. Maybe. That word was doing a lot of work. She put the list in her coat pocket and went out before the hands were up. The East Canyon gate was still locked. She'd put her own padlock on it after they'd come back in the dark, replacing the one Elias had opened. She'd marked the hasp with a chalk line so she'd know if it had been touched. That morning the chalk was still there, which meant Roland hadn't been out yet, or hadn't noticed. She rode back to the ranch as the sun came up and found Elias already in the barn. He had the sick roan mare in the crossed eyes and was looking at her front left hoof with a focused attention that told Evelyn he'd been at it long enough to have an opinion. "Abscess," he said without looking up. "Needs to be poulticed and kept off it for 10 days. She's been carrying it a while." Thomas had noticed the mare limping in November. They'd thought she'd worked through it. She hadn't. "Curtis was going to get to her," Evelyn said. "Curtis has got a lot to get to." He set the hoof down gently. "I'll handle her." It wasn't a criticism. It was just the truth, said the same flat way he said everything, and she found she didn't have any argument for it. She told him what she needed, someone to ride the east boundary twice daily and keep a log of anything he saw, any vehicles on the county road, any sign of activity near the canyon entrance. She told him to do it quietly and not to mention the canyon gate to Pell, not because she didn't trust Pell, but because Pell was young and not good at keeping his face empty when he knew something. Elias listened without interrupting. When she was done, he said, "You think he'll move the calves before the hearing?" "If he finds out we've been in there, yes." "How much time do we have before someone tells him?" She thought about that. 2 days, maybe 3. "There's no one on this property I don't trust, but he's been talking to people for months. Someone will say something without meaning to." "Then we need whatever we're going to need before that." "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "What do you need from me that you haven't said yet?" She'd been waiting for him to ask that, or something like it, and she still wasn't sure how to answer it. What she needed from him was something she couldn't quite name. Not labor, exactly. Not information. A witness, maybe. Someone who had no stake in the valley and its alliances, no history with Roland or the board or the neighbors who'd gone quiet. Someone who'd simply seen the gate and the calves and the fresh brands, and who couldn't be explained away as a cross-partisan. "I need you to be willing to say what you saw," she said. "That's the easy part." He went back to the mare's hoof. She stood there a moment longer than she needed to, then went to the house to make breakfast. The trouble started 2 days later, which was faster than she'd expected. She was in town at Freeling's Hardware, picking up wire and a new valve for the water tank, when she heard it from 2 women talking in the next aisle. They weren't whispering. They didn't know she was there. "I heard she took on a hired man, moved him right into the bunkhouse, him and his daughter both." "No? That's what Dottie said." And Dottie heard it from Marion, who heard it from Roland himself. "Well," a pause, the specific kind that means someone is deciding how much judgment to voice. "It's not my business how a widow keeps herself company." "It's not the company, it's the... Well, it doesn't look right, does it? A man nobody knows, living on the property. What does she actually know about him?" Evelyn came around the end of the aisle, and both women stopped talking with the particular jerk of people caught mid-sentence. She knew them both. Helen Pruitt, whose husband Roy shared the north drainage with the Cross property, and Beverly Kellerman, who'd brought a pie to Thomas's funeral and cried what appeared to be genuine tears. She didn't say anything to them. She just looked at them long enough for it to mean something, then went to the counter and paid for her wire. In the truck on the way back, she sat with both hands on the wheel and thought about what Roland had done. He hadn't accused her of anything specific. He'd just let the picture form in other people's minds. A widow alone. A strange man in the bunkhouse. The story wrote itself in a way that no one could be held responsible for, that Roland could deny having said with his hand on whatever he swore by. She'd known this was how he operated. She'd watched him do it to Thomas, smaller versions of it over the years. The way he'd imply without stating, suggest without accusing, so that nothing could ever be pinned to him but the damage accumulated anyway. She just hadn't expected it to move this fast. When she got back to the ranch, the fence was down. It was the west section, the long run of post and wire along the county road that she'd had Curtis repair in April. She stood looking at it from the truck window and felt the specific heaviness of a person who keeps finding out that things are worse than they thought. Curtis was already there, crouched over one of the posts, and when she walked up, she saw immediately that the post hadn't rotted through or taken a hit from a deer. The wire had been cut, clean, with fencing pliers in 3 places along a 40-foot section. "When?" she said. "Sometime last night. I didn't ride this section this morning. I was on the north." He looked up at her. "I should have ridden this section. It's not your fault." "No, but that's not going to put the fence back." She looked at the gap. No cattle had gone through. They'd been moved to the south pasture 2 days ago, which she'd done on instinct, not planning, and was now quietly grateful for. But the gap was visible from the county road, and anyone driving past would see a cross fence down, which was exactly the kind of thing that got mentioned at lease board hearings. "Fix it today," she said. "All of it. Don't leave anything that looks like we can't maintain the property." Curtis nodded. He didn't ask who'd cut it. He had the same red she did. She was walking back to the truck when Pell came out of the barn at a run, which he didn't do unless something was wrong. "The branding rack," he said, and his voice was off, tight in a way that made her stomach drop. She walked to the back of the barn and smelled it before she saw it. Scorched wood, the sharp chemical smell of burning metal. The branding rack. The one Thomas's father had built in 1931. The one they'd used every spring since she'd come to this ranch, was a pile of blackened timber. Someone had set it on fire in the night. What was left was a skeleton of charred wood with the iron fittings sitting in the ash. She stood and looked at it for a long time. The irons were salvageable. The rack wasn't. She'd need to build a new one before spring branding, which was expensive and time-consuming and would cost labor she didn't have. But the rack itself wasn't what mattered, but the rack could be rebuilt. What mattered was that someone had come onto her property in the dark and done this, had walked right up to her barn and done it, and she'd been 50 yards away in the house and hadn't heard a thing. That was what she kept coming back to, not the loss, the intrusion. Elias appeared behind her. She didn't hear him come up. He had a way of arriving quietly, not sneaky, just unhurried enough that he didn't make noise. He looked at the ruins of the rack for a while. "He's escalating," he said. "I know. He's trying to make you react before you're ready." She looked at him. "I know that too." "Are you going to?" "No." She picked up one of the salvageable irons from the ash, turned it in her hands. It was still warm. "I'm going to fix the fence, poultice the mare, and make sure everything on this property looks like it's being run correctly. I'm not going to react. I'm going to make him think I'm not as close as I am." Elias was quiet for a moment, then, "That's a harder thing to do than it sounds." "Yes, it is." She went inside and wrote a letter to Walt Odom, the land surveyor. She kept it brief. She had reason to believe there was an encroachment issue on the east boundary of the Cross property, and she'd value his professional assessment before the lease hearing. She didn't mention Roland. She didn't mention the canyon gate. She wrote it as a business-like land question, the kind a responsible ranch owner might raise, and she addressed it and put it in the mailbox before she changed her mind. Then she drove to May Dunbar's place. May was 61 and had been running her own ranch alone since her husband Bud died in 1952. She was not a soft woman. She was the kind of woman who dealt with problems by looking at them directly and deciding what to do, which Evelyn had always respected and now needed badly. She told May everything. The canyon gate, the calves, the fresh brands over old marks, the burned rack, the cut fence. She told her about Roland's visits and the document he'd brought, and the things she was hearing in town. She told her about Elias Boone and the burned cedar chip. May listened without interrupting, which was one of her best qualities. When Evelyn was done, May poured them both coffee and said, "What do you need from me?" "I need someone to come to the canyon with me who the board will listen to. Someone who isn't a Cross employee and isn't a Cross relation and doesn't have a reason to take my side." "I've got a reason to take your side. I've known you for 12 years. "They don't need to know that's why you came." May looked at her for a long moment. "Roland's going to make things difficult for me if I do this." "Yes. He's got friends on that board. I know. Harlan Pruitt, for one. Maybe Cyrus Dean." "Cyrus isn't his friend. Cyrus is just afraid of him, which comes out the same way." May drank her coffee. "When?" "Before the end of the week. I want to bring Walt Odom too if he'll come." "Walt will come. Walt doesn't like Roland, but more than that, Walt doesn't like things being wrong in the land records. He's that kind of man." She set her cup down. "I'll be there. What time?" Evelyn drove back with the first solid thing she'd felt in 2 days sitting in her chest. Not hope exactly, more like the feeling of having your feet on ground, you know. That evening, Lark found the second piece. Evelyn didn't see it happen. She was in the house going over the lease documents when Curtis knocked and told her to come. She went to the barn where Lark was standing in the entrance, holding something out in her small hand with the patience of someone who'd been waiting a reasonable amount of time and was prepared to wait more. It was another cedar chip, smaller than the first, with the same scorched edge, the same smooth side. But this one had 2 marks carved into it, the Cross brand, and beside it a second mark that was almost but not quite the same, a small difference in the crosshatch pattern, the kind of variation you'd produce if you were copying a brand by hand and working quickly. Evelyn stared at it. A forged brand marker. Someone had made a practice version, a rough template carved in cedar, and they'd used it near enough to the canyon that the chips had ended up on or near the east road. She looked at Lark. "Where did you find this?" The girl pointed east. Then she held up 4 fingers. 4. 4 miles. Further than the first one. Elias was in the doorway behind Lark, and Evelyn looked at him. He had the expression of someone doing addition in their head. "She's been ranging," he said. "I told her to stay near the yard." "Don't," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "Don't tell her to stop." Evelyn looked at Lark again. "She's seen things we're riding past." The girl's expression didn't change much, but something in it settled, the slight loosening of a person who's been waiting to be told they're not wrong. The next morning, Roland came to the road without coming to the house. He stopped his truck at the gate and stood beside it for a long time, looking up toward the barn. Evelyn watched him from the kitchen window, drinking her coffee, keeping her face away from the glass. He wasn't doing anything. He was just standing there, looking at the property, the way a man looks at something he's already counted as his. Then he drove away. Curtis reported it to her 10 minutes later as though she hadn't seen it, and she appreciated that. She appreciated that he was still treating it as information she needed rather than something he'd handled. "He's watching the traffic," she said. "He wants to know if anyone's been in." "Walt Odom came by yesterday evening," Curtis said. "I met him at the east boundary. He looked at the fence line where the gate is. He didn't say much, but he wrote things down." "Did Roland's truck come past yesterday?" "Not that I saw." "Not that you saw," she repeated, and didn't say the rest of it. She was careful for the next 4 days. She kept the ranch running as normally as she could. Fence work, water tank repair, the daily count, all the visible maintenance that a healthy operation produced. She made sure there was nothing that looked like preparation, nothing that looked like she knew something. On the 4th day, Harlan Pruitt from the lease board stopped in. Harlan was 68, white-haired, with the deliberate manner of a man who had learned, sometime in middle age, that the best way to have power was to move slowly. He came in his personal truck, not a county vehicle, which meant this was unofficial, which meant it was more important than if it had been official. She invited him in and made coffee because it would have been strange not to. He sat at the kitchen table and looked around with the eyes of a man adding up details. The neatness of the room, the documents stacked by the window, the list she'd forgotten to put away. "I wanted to check in," he said, "ahead of the hearing." "That's kind of you." "Things in order out here?" "Things are in order." He drank his coffee. She waited. She was good at waiting. "Roland Cross spoke to me," he said. "I'd expect he did. He has some concerns about the stewardship of the property, about whether the lease commitments are being met, given the staffing situation." "My staffing situation is being managed." She kept her voice level. "I brought on a new hand 10 days ago, experienced. The fencing is current. The cattle count," she paused, chose her words, "is being actively tracked." He mentioned the branding rack. She looked at him. "Did he also mention that the branding rack burned down 2 nights after I hired Elias Boone? That the fence on the county road was cut the same week?" Something moved in Harlan's face. Not surprise, or not entirely surprise. "He didn't mention that." "No, I'd expect he didn't." She poured more coffee, not because she wanted it, but because it gave her something to do with her hands. "Harlan, I have been running this ranch for 11 months. I have made every lease payment. I have maintained the water rights, the grazing rotation, the boundary fences, with the exception of one section that was sabotaged and repaired the same day. I have done all of this short 2 hands, with a husband 6 months in the ground when this season started." She set the coffee pot down. "I would like to know, from you directly, what I need to show the board at that hearing." He was quiet for a moment. "Documentation," he said finally. "Maintenance logs, stock records, anything that shows the property is being managed." "I have all of that." "And the short count." "I'm working on the short count." She met his eyes. "I expect to have a full account of those animals before the hearing." He looked at her for a long moment. She couldn't read him. Harlan Pruitt had spent 40 years being unreadable, and he was good at it. But he put his coffee cup down in a deliberate way, and he said, "I'll tell you this, Evelyn, and I'm telling you because I thought well of Thomas. Whatever you've got, bring it. Don't hold it back because you're not sure the board will listen. Bring it all and make them look at it." She nodded. "I will." After he left, she sat for a while with the cedar chips on the table in front of her, the 2 of them side by side. The first one with the single cross brand. The second with the cross brand and the copy beside it, the forged version. Two pieces of the same carving scattered across miles of road. She picked up the second one and turned it over. The back was rough cut, the cedar still pale. And in the corner, small enough that she'd almost missed it the first time, a partial stamp, the kind a supplier might put on a cut timber. Just a few letters. She'd been assuming it meant nothing. She looked at it again now, FRL, and below that, the number 14. She didn't know what FRL meant. She didn't know what 14 meant. But she wrote it down, and then she went to find Elias, because he'd been on more roads and more counties than she had, and might know something she didn't. He was at the water tank when she found him, standing on the ladder with his arms inside the housing, doing something to the valve she hadn't asked him to do, but was apparently doing anyway. FRL, she said. Does that mean anything to you? A supplier, maybe? Timber? Cedar? He was quiet for a moment, working. Then, Fremont River Lumber. They've got a yard outside of Lander, supply posts, rails, cedar fence stock. She wrote it down. The number 14? Lot number, maybe. Delivery batch. He came down off the ladder and looked at her. You think the cedar in that canyon came from a supplier. I think someone bought cedar posts to build that gate and didn't think about what was stamped on the scraps. He considered that. When's the hearing? Week from Friday. Then you need to go to Fremont River Lumber before then. Yes. He looked at her steadily. I'll go. You shouldn't be the one asking. Someone will mention it to Roland before you get back to the truck. She started to say she could handle it herself. Then she stopped, because the honest answer was that he was right, and the time for protecting her pride was behind her. Take Lark, she said. She'll remember things. He almost smiled at that. It didn't quite make it to his face, but she could see it at the edges. She usually does. That night, the last of her doubts about Elias Boone mostly settled, not because of anything dramatic, because of a small thing. She was coming back from checking the East Canyon at dusk, the chalk line still intact, when she saw Lark sitting on the bunkhouse steps with a piece of paper on her knee, drawing. Evelyn stopped. The girl had drawn the second cedar chip. Exactly. In pencil, the two brand marks side by side, the cross brand and the near copy. And below them, in careful child's handwriting. Not the same. She'd been studying them. She'd been thinking about the difference between the real mark and the copied one, between the original and the forgery. She'd been, in her quiet way, building the same case Evelyn was building from the other direction. Evelyn crouched down to be at her level. Can I keep that? She said. Lark looked at her, then at the paper. She handed it over. Thank you, Evelyn said. The girl went back to whatever she'd been doing before. Evelyn stood up with the drawing in her hand and went inside. She added it to the pile on the kitchen table. The two cedar chips, the brand records, the maintenance logs, Walt Odom's preliminary notes that he'd left in her mailbox 2 days ago. The drawing of the two marks side by side, the difference between them visible to anyone who looked. Not the same. 2 words. A child's handwriting. And yet there it was, as clear as anything a lawyer could put together. She straightened the pile and looked at it. It wasn't enough yet. But it was becoming enough, which was a different thing, and a thing she hadn't been sure of a week ago. She thought about Harlan Pruitt saying, "Bring it all and make them look at it." And she thought about Roland standing at her gate that morning, looking at her property like he was already counting inventory. She thought about the women in the hardware store and the hands who'd left and the neighbors who'd gone quiet. She thought about Thomas at this table, teaching her things she hadn't known she'd need. She turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, and for the first time in several nights, she slept. It wasn't good sleep, what? She woke twice, checked the window, heard nothing, went back down. But the sleep was there, which was something. She was still tired in the morning. She was still short 2 hands and a branding rack, and 22 calves in a canyon she couldn't move yet, and a lease hearing bearing down like weather. But she'd stopped thinking about whether she could do this and started thinking only about how. That was the difference. It was a small difference, but she'd learned in 11 months of running the Cross Ranch alone that small differences were usually the ones that mattered. She got up before light and made coffee and went out to start the day. Elias came back from Fremont River Lumber on a Wednesday, 3 days before the hearing. He came in the way he did everything, without announcement, pulling the wagon into the yard and unhitching the horses before he came to find her. Lark climbed down from the bench and went directly to the bunkhouse, which meant she was tired, which meant they'd been on the road a while. Evelyn watched from the porch and waited. He came across the yard with a piece of paper folded in his breast pocket and the expression of a man who had found what he went looking for and wasn't sure yet how much of it was good news. "Lot Fortin," he said, and handed her the paper. She unfolded it. It was a sales receipt. Not the original, but a careful hand copy, the kind you made when the clerk was willing to let you look but not to surrender the document. Lot 14, Fremont River Lumber, Lander. 14 cedar fence posts and 40 feet of 6-gauge wire. Sold 5 weeks ago. She read the name on the receipt, Dale Muir. She looked up. "Who's Dale Muir?" "That's what I asked. Clerk said he's a day laborer, works whatever job's available, mostly out of Lander." Elias paused. "He's worked for Roland Cross 3 times in the last 2 years. She folded the paper and held it. "The clerk told you that?" "The clerk had a ledger. Roland paid Muir through a company account, name of Cross Valley Grazing LLC. Clerk knew the account because it comes in regular." He looked at her steadily. "He didn't know he was telling me anything." She turned the receipt over in her hands. Dale Muir bought the cedar. Roland paid Dale Muir. The posts went into the canyon gate. The scraps ended up on the road, one of them finding its way 3 miles east where a drifter with a quiet daughter picked it up and brought it to her door. The chain wasn't complete. It wouldn't hold in a courtroom without Muir himself, and Muir was Roland's man, and Roland's men didn't talk. But it was enough to build from. It was enough to put in front of the board beside everything else and let them do the arithmetic. "Did the clerk know you were connected to the Cross Ranch?" "I didn't say who I was working for, just said I was tracking down some fence materials that might have been ordered by mistake for our property." His voice was even. "That's not a lie, exactly." "No," she agreed. "It's not." She looked at the receipt again. Then she went inside and added it to the pile on the kitchen table, which was getting thick enough now that she'd started organizing it. The brand records in one stack, the maintenance logs in another, Walt Odom's survey notes, Lark's drawing, the 2 cedar chips in a cotton cloth to keep them from damage. The receipt went with the chips. She stood back and looked at all of it. It still wasn't the calves. The documents were background, context, the map of how it had happened. But the calves were the thing itself, the proof that couldn't be explained away with accounting or paperwork. 22 animals behind a gate in the East Canyon, wearing brands that had been laid over the original cross marks, and she was the only one who'd seen them besides her own people. She needed the board to see them. She needed witnesses who weren't Curtis and Pell and Elias, people Roland couldn't dismiss as her employees saying what she'd told them to say. She needed May and Walt Odom, and ideally Harlan Pruitt himself, and she needed them in that canyon before Roland found out she was coming. The hearing was in 3 days. She'd been watching the chalk line on the canyon gate every morning, and it had held. Roland hadn't been there, or hadn't been there in a way that disturbed the mark. But that could change any hour. All it took was one loose word from anyone who'd seen her riding the east boundary. One neighbor mentioning to the wrong person that the Cross widow was spending time near the old canyon pasture. She sent Curtis to Mays that evening with a note. She wrote it plain, "Tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock. Come to the east boundary, not the main gate. Tell no one." Then she went to find Elias. He was in the small corral behind the bunkhouse working with one of his horses, a gray that had gone stiff in the right shoulder. He had the horse moving in slow circles on a long rope, watching the shoulder, his attention entirely on the animal. He didn't look up when she came to the fence, but he knew she was there. "Tomorrow," she said. "Early. I'm bringing May Dunbar and Walt Odom into the canyon. I want you there." "All right. If Roland comes, when Roland comes, I need you to stand and not move. Whatever he says, whatever he threatens, I need a man who won't step back." He stopped the horse and looked at her. "I won't step back." She believed him. She wasn't entirely sure why. She'd known him less than 2 weeks, which wasn't long enough to be certain of a person. But she'd watched him long enough to see how he handled difficulty, and what she'd seen was a man who got quieter as things got worse, which was the opposite of how dangerous men usually behaved. Dangerous men got louder. Elias Boone got still. And Lark, she said, I want her there too. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. She sees things, Evelyn said. She's been seeing things since the day you pulled into this yard. I want her there as another set of eyes. She's 8 years old. I know how old she is. He was quiet. Then, if it gets rough, I'll keep her behind me, but I want her there. He turned the gray loose and watched it walk to the water trough. All right, he said again. That was how he agreed to things. Not yes or I will, or count on me. Just all right. She'd stopped finding it strange. It meant exactly what it said. She woke at 4 the next morning to the sound of rain. Not the soaking rain the valley needed, a thin, cold October rain that made the ground slick and the visibility gray. She lay in the dark and listened to it on the roof and thought about what it would mean to bring 4 people into the canyon in wet weather on ground that would be soft enough to take prints. Then she thought about what it would mean to wait another day and whether Roland would be patient enough to give her that day. She got up and put her boots on. May arrived at the east boundary at 5:50, 10 minutes early, driving her own truck in the dark with her lights off the last quarter mile, which told Evelyn she understood the situation without being told. Walt Odom came behind her in his survey truck, with his equipment cases in the back and his reading glasses already on, which meant he'd been up for a while and was prepared to work. She shook their hands in the thin drizzle. I want to tell you what you're going to see before you see it, she said, so you know what to look for, and you can look for it yourselves without me pointing. I don't want anyone to be able to say I led you to a conclusion. May nodded. Walt had his notebook already. She told them about the calves, the approximate count, the condition of the gate, the fresh brands over old marks. She told them what she expected they'd find and why she believed the cross brand would be visible beneath Roland's mark on the earlier branded animals. She told them about the cedar chips and Fremont River lumber and Dale Muir's name on the receipt. Walt wrote while she talked. May stood with her arms crossed and her face doing the thing Evelyn had seen it do before, processing, hardening, the specific expression of a woman who has been around enough wrong behavior to recognize it quickly. How many of your own animals? Walt said when she finished. 22 visible from the gate. There may be more in the back section. And the brands are fresh? Fresh enough that they hadn't fully healed when we found them 9 days ago. Some of them are still scabbing. He wrote that down. Branding date would put the rebranding after Thomas died, after the estate went through probate, after I was left managing alone. She kept her voice flat. Yes. He looked at her over his glasses. That's a long time to have been planning this. I know. Elias was waiting at the gate with Lark beside him. Pell had stayed back at the ranch. She'd told him he was needed for the morning feed, which was true. But mostly she wanted him where Roland might see him and think nothing was unusual. Curtis was somewhere between the main gate and the east boundary, watching the county road. She opened the padlock with her key and pushed the gate in. The smell reached them immediately. Cattle, manure, the wet animal smell of animals that had been in an enclosed space in damp weather. And then the sound. Calves calling. A low, uncertain sound. The sound of animals that were hungry and didn't understand why. They went in. The canyon opened behind the screen of juniper into a rough natural bowl maybe 300 yards across, with a rocky south wall and a grassy floor that sloped down to a dry creek bed. It was good hidden land, the kind of terrain that looked like nothing from outside because the juniper blocked the sight lines, but that held water in spring and grass through summer better than most exposed pastures. Someone had known this land, had known it long enough to plan. The calves were grouped near the creek bed, 22 of them in a loose cluster, wet from the rain and not happy about it. Evelyn walked to the nearest one, a spotted heifer calf, maybe 4 months old, and crouched beside her. The brand on her left ribs was a lazy R inside a diamond, Roland's mark. But the edges of it, where the iron hadn't pressed quite clean, showed something darker beneath. The scar tissue of an earlier brand, partially covered. She looked up at Walt. Come look at this. He came and crouched beside her, his reading glasses fogging slightly in the cold. He looked at the brand for a long time. He touched the edges carefully, the way he handled his survey instruments. Precise, respectful of what the evidence was trying to say. There's a prior mark, he said. Yes. The scar pattern beneath the fresh brand. He traced the outline with his finger without touching. That's a crosshatch. That's not consistent with the current mark. That's the Cross brand, Evelyn said. My brand, registered 1892. May was already moving among the calves, looking at them one by one with her hands on her knees and her face close to the brands. She was a cattle woman who'd been branding animals since she was 12 years old, and she didn't need Walt's analysis to tell her what she was seeing. Every one of them, she said, without looking up. Every single one. Walt was writing in his notebook. The rain was coming down harder now, a steady cold drizzle, and Evelyn watched him carefully wrap his notebook in a piece of oilcloth from his coat pocket to keep the ink from running. He had come prepared to document. She felt a rush of gratitude for him that she hadn't expected, for his caution, his care, his understanding that what he wrote down today might need to hold up somewhere harder than this canyon. She was watching him write when Lark tugged her sleeve. She looked down. The girl was pointing toward the south wall of the canyon, the rocky section where the land rose. She was pointing with that same level calm she brought to everything, no urgency in it, just certainty. What is it? Lark turned and walked toward the south wall without checking to see if Evelyn followed. Evelyn followed. Behind a fold in the rock face, half hidden by an overhang, was a section she hadn't seen on her first visit. A narrow slot in the canyon wall, barely wide enough for a horse to pass through, and beyond it, she could hear it before she saw it, more cattle. She went through the slot. There were 9 more calves in the back section, younger ones, more recently taken, their brands raw-looking and new. And against the back wall of the rock, barely visible in the gray morning light, was something else. A wooden post driven into the ground with a double iron ring at the top, and hanging from the ring, the tool itself. The branding iron. Roland's branding iron, the lazy R in its diamond, wrapped in burlap and leaned against the post like it lived there, like it had been used here many times. She stood and looked at it for a long time. Then she went back through the slot and called to Walt. He came through carefully, a big man picking his way over the wet rock, and he stopped when he saw the iron and the post and the newer calves against the wall. He didn't say anything. He opened his oilcloth notebook and wrote for nearly a full minute, then straightened and looked at Evelyn. I'm going to need to record the serial number on that iron, he said, if there is one. There was. Roland had stamped his initials into the handle, RC, small but legible, which was the kind of thing a careful man did to keep his equipment from walking off, and the kind of thing a careful man didn't think about when that same equipment was evidence. Walt wrote it down. They were still in the back section when they heard the truck. It came from the north, the county roadside, and the sound of it was wrong, too fast, too loud for a road that was muddy from the rain. Evelyn came out of the slot and looked toward the canyon entrance and heard the gate hit the fence post, which meant someone had opened it hard. Roland came in on foot, having left the truck outside. He was wearing his ranch coat, the canvas one, and he had 2 men behind him. Dale Muir, whose face Evelyn didn't know but would always remember after this, and a younger man she didn't recognize at all. Roland walked the way he walked into her kitchen, like the space belonged to him. He stopped when he saw the group. His eyes moved quickly. Evelyn, May, Walt, Elias standing to one side with Lark behind him. He processed it fast, and she could see the calculation happening, the same thing that had been happening since Thomas's funeral. What can I manage? What can I explain? What can I control? Evelyn, his voice was careful. What are you doing on my grazing allotment? This isn't your allotment. I filed a supplemental claim with the board, pending the hearing. He said it smoothly, like he'd prepared it, which he had. These animals are under my care pending the resolution. May Dunbar made a sound, not a word, just a sound. The sound a woman makes when she's heard something too dishonest to let pass without acknowledgement. Roland looked at her. May, I'd think carefully about your involvement here. I'd think carefully about your next sentence, May said. Walt has been writing in that notebook for the last 20 minutes. Something shifted in Roland's face. He looked at Walt, at the notebook, at the careful way Walt was standing. Not defensive, not alarmed, just present and recording. Walt Odom was the kind of man whose presence at an event changed what the event meant, and Roland understood that, and Evelyn could see him understanding it and not knowing yet what to do with it. Those brands are my marks, Roland said. Any prior mark is coincidental. The iron is in the back section, Evelyn said. stamped RC on the handle. Walt has the serial number. We have the Fremont River lumber receipt with Dale Muir's name on it, and your company account. She kept her voice level. She'd been rehearsing this moment in her head for days without knowing it, keeping it factual, keeping the emotion out of the language even though it was filling every other part of her. We have 2 cedar chips with the Cross brand carved on one face and your copied version beside it. We have a child's drawing of the difference between the 2 marks that any person in the valley could read. Roland's eyes moved to Elias. This man has been on your property less than 2 weeks, he said. You don't know where he came from or what he's done. Whatever he's shown you. He brought me a cedar chip, Evelyn said. The rest I found myself. Evelyn. Roland's voice shifted, dropped, went somewhere quieter and more dangerous. You need to think about this. You are standing in a canyon making accusations against a Cross family member with no legal standing. No, I have legal standing, she said. My name is on the lease. My brand is under your iron. That heifer calf over there is 9 days older than the date you filed your supplemental claim, which means she was taken before you had any legal basis for holding her, which means… She stopped. Let it sit. Which means you stole her. The word landed. Roland didn't move, but something in him reorganized, and she saw the moment when he shifted from trying to manage her to trying to manage the witnesses. Walt, he said, you're a professional man. You're a careful man. You don't want to be part of something you don't fully understand. Walt looked at him over his reading glasses. I understand what I've written down, Roland. May, he turned to her. Our families have been neighbors for 20 years. Don't, May said. He was running out of options and he knew it, and when a man like Roland ran out of options, he didn't go quiet. He found the one lever left, and he pulled it. He turned to Elias. You, he said. I looked into you. Elias Boone, out of Sheridan. You want to tell Mrs. Cross what happened in Sheridan? You want to tell her what you left behind? Elias didn't move. His face didn't change. He looked at Roland the way he looked at things he'd already decided about, steadily, without surprise. You can tell her whatever you found, he said. It won't change what's in that notebook. Roland looked at Lark then, and something about the way he looked at her, calculating, trying to find a weakness even in a child, made the anger in Evelyn go from the slow, deep kind to something else entirely. Don't, she said. Her voice came out harder than she intended. Don't you look at her. Roland looked back at her. The canyon was quiet except for the rain and the calves and the sound of Dale Muir shifting his weight somewhere behind his employer. You can't hold these animals, Roland said. You have no authority. I'm not holding them. I'm standing here. She moved to the canyon entrance, to the narrow passage between the juniper screen and the gate, and she stopped there. You can leave the same way you came in. Walt and May will go to the board this afternoon. The hearing is in 2 days. She stood in the gap. But these animals stay here until the board comes to look at them. I'm not moving them, and I'm not moving. Roland looked at her standing in the entrance. He looked at Elias, who had moved to a position just to her left without being asked, and at May, who had crossed her arms and was watching him the way she watched things she'd already made up her mind about. He looked at Dale Muir, who was looking at the ground. Muir, he said. Muir kept looking at the ground. Muir. The man looked up slowly. He was maybe 45, weathered, the kind of face that had spent too many years doing whatever came next without asking why. He looked at Roland, then at Evelyn, then at the calves standing in the rain. He didn't say anything. But he took a half step backward, and the half step was everything. Roland saw it. Evelyn saw Roland see it. I'll be at the board today, Roland said. His voice had gone flat and thin, stripped of the careful modulation he usually kept on it. I'll have my attorney. Bring him, Evelyn said. Bring whoever you want. Bring the whole board. I'll be here. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out through the gate, and the younger man went with him. Dale Muir stood for a moment longer, looking at the calves, looking at Evelyn, and then he followed without a word. The gate swung on its hinge in the wet air. May let out a long breath. Walt was still writing. Elias hadn't moved from his position by the entrance, and he didn't move now. He stayed where he was until the sound of Roland's truck engine turned over and moved away on the county road. Then he stepped back and looked at Evelyn. That went about how I expected, he said. She didn't answer right away. Her hands were trembling slightly, which she hadn't noticed until now. She put them in her coat pocket so no one would see. Walt, she said, what do you need from me to make that notebook mean something at the hearing? He looked up. A signed statement from you detailing when you first found the gate and what condition it was in. A statement from Curtis Webb as a long-term employee confirming when this pasture was last actively used and under whose authority. Your brand registration documentation, original or certified copy. He paused. And I'd like to take the branding iron with me, as a physical exhibit. It's Roland's property. It's evidence on your land found in the commission of what appears to be brand fraud. I'll leave that determination to the board, but I'd like to have it available. She thought about that. It felt like the edge of something legal she didn't fully understand. Take it, she said. I'll document that I gave it to you. He nodded and went back through the slot to retrieve it. May came to stand beside Evelyn. They stood looking at the calves, at the rain beating on the animals' backs, at the canyon that had been sitting here holding a secret for months while the valley went on normally around it. He really thought you'd fold, May said. He's been counting on it since Thomas died. He underestimated you. He underestimated the land, Evelyn said. It keeps records. It doesn't care who's trying to erase them. May looked at her sideways. That's a strange thing to say? Thomas used to say it. I never understood it until now. She sent Curtis to Harlan Pruitt that afternoon with a written request. Would the board be willing to conduct a site visit to the East Canyon pasture of the Cross Ranch before the formal hearing to examine evidence of potential brand fraud? The request was formal, polite, and attached to Walt Odom's preliminary survey notes and a one-page summary of what the site contained. She didn't know if Harlan would come. She didn't know if he'd already decided against her or if Roland had gotten to him between the canyon and now. She told him to bring it all and make them look at it, and she was doing that. But a man could say one thing in your kitchen and do another in front of his colleagues. She waited. Lark found her on the porch at dusk, sitting with the cedar chips in her hand. The girl climbed up on the step below her and sat, not touching her, just present the way she was present. Close enough to know you weren't alone, far enough to give you room. Evelyn looked at her, at the dark, watchful eyes and the small, careful hands, and the way she held herself, self-contained, like someone who had learned early that you didn't always get to say what you needed, and so you learned to carry it instead. She thought about what Roland had said, about Sheridan, about what Elias had left behind. It wasn't her business. She'd told herself that more than once. But she thought about a man who moved like someone who'd spent time being careful, who'd said, I'd rather not say with his eyes steady, who'd put himself between her and Roland in that canyon without being asked. Whatever he'd done or hadn't done in Sheridan, he'd stood in that canyon today. Your father's a good man, she said. Lark looked at her. I think he's trying to be, Evelyn amended. That's not always the same thing, but it's worth something. The girl turned and looked out at the darkening valley, at the hills and the fence line and the county road beyond. Then she reached into her pocket and brought out a piece of paper. A new drawing, done today, sometime during the hours Evelyn hadn't been watching. She held it out. It was the canyon, rough but recognizable, the juniper screen, the gate, the calves in a group, the slot in the south wall. And in the corner, small and precise, the two brand marks again, the real one and the copied one. And a line drawn between them, and at the end of the line, a question mark. Not the same. Who? Evelyn held the drawing and looked at it. We're going to answer that, she said. 2 days. She went inside and added the drawing to the pile and began drafting her statement for Walt. Outside, the rain had stopped. The valley was quiet in the way it got after weather, washed clean, everything sharp and close, the air cold enough to hurt a little if you breathed in deep. She could hear the horses in the corral, and somewhere distant, faint on the wind, the sound of calves in the canyon calling into the dark. She rode until the lamp oil was low. Then she banked the stove and went to bed and lay in the quiet and thought about Thomas teaching her water rights at this same table, and about the brand his grandfather had registered in 1892, and about what it meant to inherit a thing, and what it meant to keep it. She thought she wouldn't sleep, but she did. Harlan Pruitt's response came the next morning, delivered by hand. Not the mail, not a phone call, but a boy on a bicycle who knocked on the door at 7:30 and handed Evelyn a sealed envelope and waited for a reply. The note was short. 4 sentences. The board would conduct a site visit to the East Canyon pasture at 9 o'clock the morning of the hearing. All 5 members would be present. She was to have the evidence accessible without moving or altering anything in the intervening period. Harlan's signature was at the bottom, and beneath it, in a different pen, a second signature she hadn't expected, Cyrus Dean. May had been right about Cyrus. He wasn't Roland's friend. He was just afraid of him. And something had shifted. She wrote back, confirmed. The evidence will be as found. She gave it to the boy and watched him ride out. Then she went to the bunkhouse and knocked. Elias answered in the doorway, his hair not yet combed, a coffee cup in his hand. Behind him, she could see Lark at the small table with her breakfast, already awake and already drawing, her head bent over whatever it was. The board's coming tomorrow morning, Evelyn said. 9 o'clock, East Canyon. He nodded. I need everything exactly as we found it. The iron in the back section, the gate, the calves. Nothing moved. Understood. She started to turn away. Then she stopped because she'd been not asking the question for 2 weeks, and she was tired of the weight of not asking it. Roland said Sheridan, she said. She kept her back to him, looking at the yard. You don't have to tell me, but I need to know if it's going to come up tomorrow in front of the board. A silence, long enough that she thought he might not answer. I had a partner, he said finally, in a cattle operation outside Sheridan. We had a dispute over the books. It went badly. He paused. I hit him. She turned around. He was looking at her directly, the same way he'd looked at her the first day, not asking for anything, not defending himself, just telling her the shape of the thing and letting her decide. Were you charged? Disorderly conduct. I paid the fine. No record beyond that. He drank his coffee. The partner was skimming from the operation for 2 years. I couldn't prove it at the time. I found out later I'd been right, but by then I was already gone. That's why you left. I left because staying would have meant doing it again, and next time I might not stop at once. He said it without drama, the way he said everything. I'm not proud of it, but I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen. She looked at him, at the mended coat, the careful hands, the way he stood in his own doorway like a man who didn't fully claim any space but stood in it honestly. Roland will use it tomorrow, she said. Probably. It won't change the brands or the iron or what Walt wrote in his notebook. No, he agreed. It won't. Then it's manageable. She turned back toward the house. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be long. She didn't sleep well herself. She lay in the dark and went over it. Not the facts. She'd been over the facts enough times that they were worn smooth in her mind. She went over the people. Harlan, Cyrus Dean, the other 3 board members, a rancher named Vic Hollis, who'd been neutral in everything for 20 years, a banker named Foster Crane, who she'd spoken to maybe 6 times in her life, and a woman named Ruth Aldridge, who ran a sheep operation east of town and who Evelyn knew mostly by reputation. Ruth was said to be sharp and impatient, and not particularly interested in being told what to think, which was the best thing Evelyn could say about any of them going into tomorrow. Roland would have an attorney. She didn't have an attorney. There hadn't been money for one, and she hadn't wanted to spend the week before the hearing trying to explain the situation to someone who'd never set foot in the canyon. She had Walt's documentation, May's witness account, her own statements, and the physical evidence in the canyon. She had the Fremont River lumber receipt. She had Lark's drawings. She didn't know if it was enough. She knew it was more than she'd had 2 weeks ago, which was nothing, and she knew that nothing had felt like certain defeat. So she would take more than nothing. She was in the kitchen at 5 with the lamp on when she heard the wagon. She went to the window and looked out, and in the early dark she could see a light at the east boundary. Not Roland, the angle was wrong. It was coming from the south. She watched it for a moment before she understood. May Dunbar, arriving in the dark to make sure everything was still in order. Arriving early because that was the kind of woman May was. Evelyn put on her coat and went out. They rode the boundary together in the cold, checking the chalk line on the gate, still intact, and the pasture fence and the county road where it ran past the canyon entrance. Everything was as it had been. The calves were calling softly in the dark, and when Evelyn shone her lantern through the gate, she could see them grouped near the creek bed the way they'd been grouped every morning for the week she'd been watching them. They'd grown used to the routine. They didn't know anything had changed. "How are you holding up?" May said. "I'm functional." "That's not what I asked." Evelyn looked at the gate, at the chalk mark. "I'm scared," she said. It was the first time she'd said it to anyone. Not of Roland, of the board deciding it's easier to give him what he wants than to deal with what he's done. "That's a reasonable fear. You're supposed to tell me it'll be fine." "I don't know that it'll be fine. I know that what's in that canyon is what it is, and you can't control what they do with it." May pulled her coat collar up against the wind. "What you can control is how you stand when they look at it." That was not especially comforting and was entirely true, which was very much how May operated. They rode back to the ranch as the sky began to lighten. Elias was already in the barn. Curtis had the horses ready. Pell had made a terrible pot of coffee that Evelyn drank anyway, because she needed the heat and the bitterness of it suited the morning. The board arrived at 8:50, pulling in as a convoy, Harlan in his truck, Cyrus Dean behind him, then Vic Hollis and Foster Crane together, and last, alone in a dark green truck, Ruth Aldridge. Roland arrived at 8:55 with his attorney, a compact man from Billings named Garrett, who carried a leather case and said nothing unless he was being spoken to, and sometimes not even then. They assembled at the main gate. Evelyn counted faces and did not let herself look at Roland directly, because looking at Roland directly cost her something she needed to preserve for the next 2 hours. Harlan spoke first. "We're conducting a preliminary site visit pursuant to the lease renewal hearing. This is not the formal hearing. What's observed here will become part of the record, but testimony and final determination happen at the courthouse at 2 o'clock. He looked at Evelyn. "Mrs. Cross? Lead the way." She led them to the East Canyon on horseback, most of them with Garrett the attorney in Harlan's truck because he hadn't brought a horse. The ride took 20 minutes at the pace she set. Not slow, not rushed. She talked as they rode. When the pasture had last been in active use, when Thomas had shut it down, when she'd first investigated the east boundary and why, the sequence of events from the cedar chip to the survey notes. Roland's attorney rode next to Roland, and they spoke in low tones. She didn't try to hear it. At the gate she stopped and let them dismount. Walt Odom was already there. She'd asked him to arrive at 8:30, and he had, with his notebook and his careful preparation and the branding iron in a burlap sack he'd receipted to her and brought back for this morning. "Before we go in," Evelyn said, "I want everyone to look at this." She brought out the 2 cedar chips in their cotton cloth and held them out to the group. They passed from hand to hand, Harlan, Cyrus, Vic Hollis, Ruth Aldridge, Foster Crane, Garrett, the attorney, Roland. Roland held the second chip for a moment. She watched his face. His attorney put a hand on his arm very briefly. "These were found on the county road east of this property," she said. "The first chip, 3 miles out. The second, 4 miles. The smooth face of each chip bears a carved mark. On the first chip, the Cross brand, registered 1892, documented in the county land records. On the second chip, a copy of that brand, with a variation in the crosshatch pattern." She paused. "That variation is the same variation visible on the fresh brands on the animals in this canyon, a slightly wider spacing in the upper right quadrant, resulting from copying by hand rather than using the original iron die." Ruth Aldridge was looking at the second chip with her reading glasses on. She was a thin woman with gray hair and the hands of someone who'd been working outdoors since childhood, and she held the chip the way she probably held everything, like she was deciding what it was worth. "Who found these?" she said. "My hired hand brought me the first one on the day I employed him. He found it on the road. The second was found by his daughter." Evelyn kept her voice level. "An 8-year-old child who noticed it in the brush east of the boundary fence." Ruth looked up at her over the glasses. Something moved in her expression, not yet conviction, but attention, real attention. "Go ahead," Harlan said. She opened the gate and they went in. The calves were where they'd been every morning. 31 animals in the main section, the 9 younger ones still in the back pocket behind the slot. The morning light came down into the canyon at an angle that hit the left sides of the animals clearly, and the brands were visible from 10 feet away. She walked to the spotted heifer she'd crouched beside when May and Walt first came. She brought Ruth Aldridge to her because Ruth was the one who'd looked at the cedar chip with her glasses on and asked who found it. "Look at the brand," Evelyn said. "Look at the edges." Ruth crouched, not a young woman's crouch, the deliberate crouch of someone whose knees had opinions, and looked at the heifer's ribs. She was quiet for almost a minute. "There's scarring under the fresh mark," she said. "Yes." "The pattern," Ruth stood up, her knees audible. "That's a crosshatch under there." "That's the Cross brand." Evelyn said it to the group, not just to Ruth. "The original brand is underneath. You can see it on all 31 animals in this section, and the 9 in the back section are too recently branded to show the prior mark clearly, but the iron that made those brands is back there." She nodded toward the slot. "Walt Odom has it. He also has the receipt showing the gate materials were purchased from Fremont River Lumber and Lander by a man named Dale Muir, paid through an account called Cross Valley Grazing, LLC. Roland's attorney said, "The LLC is a legitimate business entity." "Registered how long ago?" Ruth Aldridge said, without looking at him. Garrett paused. "I'd need to confirm the exact—" "I have the registration date," Walt said, opening his notebook. "Cross Valley Grazing, LLC, registered with the state 14 months ago. The Cross Ranch lease is 31 years old. Thomas Cross was alive 14 months ago." He looked at his notes. "The LLC was registered 11 months ago, actually, 3 weeks after Thomas Cross's death." The canyon was quiet. Evelyn looked at Harlan. He was standing with his arms crossed, looking at the heifer calf, and his face was doing the thing she'd seen it do in her kitchen, processing, slow and careful, building toward a conclusion he didn't want to reach hastily. She gave him time to reach it. "Roland," Harlan said, "these animals were placed here for safekeeping pending the lease." "Whose brands are under those marks?" Harlan said. It wasn't a question. Roland's jaw tightened. His attorney touched his arm again, and Roland stopped. "I'd like to see the back section," Cyrus Dean said. He'd been quiet the whole ride out, and Evelyn noticed that he'd positioned himself away from Roland since they'd arrived, a physical distance that meant something. She led them through the slot. Walt produced the branding iron from the burlap sack. He handed it to Harlan, who turned it over and looked at the handle. The RC stamp, small and clear. "Is this yours?" Harlan asked Roland. The attorney answered, "My client doesn't have to." "I'm not in a courtroom," Harlan said, with a patience that had run out sometime in the last 10 minutes. "I'm asking a man on a cattle lease whether a branding iron with his initials on it is his." Roland looked at his attorney. The attorney gave a very small shake of his head. "No comment," Roland said. Vic Hollis, who had been silent the entire morning, said, "The initials are RC, Roland Cross. Hard to say that belongs to someone else." Nobody answered that. There was nothing to answer. It was in that silence, the particular silence that follows something that doesn't need a response, that Lark came through the slot. Evelyn hadn't told her to come to the back section. She hadn't told her to stay out of it either. The girl had been present the whole morning, staying close to Elias, watching everything with those cataloging eyes. Now she came through the slot with something in her hand and stopped in front of the group. She was holding one of her drawings, the one from 2 nights ago, the canyon sketch with the 2 brand marks in the corner and the question mark between them. She looked at the assembled board members with the level calm of someone who didn't find adults particularly intimidating, walked to Walt Odom, and held the drawing up next to the branding iron he was still holding. The drawing showed the cross brand on the left, clean, even crosshatch, the original mark. On the right, the copied mark with its slightly wider upper quadrant, and below both, an arrow pointing to the iron in Walt's hands, the same wider spacing, the same variation, visible in a child's pencil drawing held up next to the physical object. Not the same. And here's the proof, Ruth Aldridge said quietly. "Oh, that's clear enough." Foster Crane had his glasses out and was looking between the drawing and the iron. He was a banker. He dealt in the difference between accurate records and altered ones for a living, and his face had the expression of a man who has seen a forgery and recognized it. The spacing matches the copy, not the original. Roland's attorney said something low and urgent near his client's ear. "Lark," Elias said, not moving from his position by the wall. The girl looked at him. "Good work," he said. She didn't smile. She just looked at him steadily and then looked back at the board, waiting. That was when Dale Muir appeared at the slot entrance. Evelyn hadn't known he was there. She'd been watching the board, watching Roland, and she hadn't heard him come in from the main canyon section. He stood in the slot opening with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who had made up his mind about something and wasn't yet sure if he'd made the right choice, but was going to find out. "Mr. Muir," Harlan said. Muir looked at Roland. Roland looked back at him, and whatever was in that look, warning, or maybe the absence of whatever had kept Muir loyal until now, Muir looked away first. "I bought the lumber," Muir said. "The posts and the wire. I built the gate." His voice was flat, the voice of someone reciting rather than testifying. "I was paid to do it and told it was a legitimate fence improvement on Cross Valley grazing land. I didn't ask further." He paused. "I'm asking now, and I don't think I like the answer." Roland's attorney said, "Mr. Muir, I'd advise—" "He's not your client," Ruth Aldridge said. The attorney stopped. Muir looked at Evelyn. "I didn't know about the calves," he said. "I built the gate. I didn't put anything behind it." She looked at him, at the weathered face and the hat turning in his hands, and the look of a man who was not a good man and knew it, and had arrived somewhat late, at a line he wasn't willing to cross. She didn't say anything to him. She looked at Harlan. "I think you have what you need for the record," she said. Harlan was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Roland, and what was in his face was not anger. It was something older and more disappointed, the look of a man who had chosen to believe something for a long time and could no longer hold it. "Roland," he said, "I'm going to ask you and your attorney to wait outside while the board confers." Roland didn't move immediately. He looked around the back section, at the calves, at the iron, at the drawing in Lark's hand, at the 5 board members ranged in front of him. He looked at Evelyn last. She met his eyes and didn't look away. He looked, in that moment, like a man counting what he had left and finding the number smaller than he'd thought. The calculation that had been running behind his eyes since Thomas's funeral, the patient arithmetic of a man who believed he had more time than anyone else. She watched it run out. He walked out through the slot without a word. His attorney followed. The board conferred for 12 minutes. Evelyn stood in the main canyon section with May and Walt and Elias and Lark and Curtis, who had come from the county road at some point and was standing at the edge of the group with his hat off. Nobody talked much. The calves moved around them peacefully, indifferent to what was being decided. Harlan came out through the slot. "We're going to the courthouse for the formal hearing as scheduled," he said. "But I want you to know, Evelyn, the board's preliminary finding, unanimous, is that the animals in this canyon are Cross Ranch stock and have been wrongfully held. Walt's documentation will go into the formal record. Dale Muir's statement will be taken as part of the hearing." He stopped, "and will be referring the matter of the brands to the county sheriff." She stood with that for a moment. "Thank you, Harlan." He looked at her. "I should have listened harder when you called the hearing unfair," he said. "I want you to know I hear that." It wasn't an apology, exactly. It wasn't quite enough to be an apology. But she'd spent 11 months learning that in this valley, between these men, that was as close as it got, and she was not going to spend her energy requiring more. 2 o'clock, she said. "I'll be there." The formal hearing lasted 3 hours. Roland's attorney made arguments that were technically careful and practically hollow, the kind of arguments that work when the facts are ambiguous and fail completely when they aren't. He challenged the provenance of the cedar chips. He questioned Elias's credibility, raising Sheridan, raising the fight, raising every version of "can you trust the man who found the evidence that he could construct?" He suggested the LLC had been misrepresented and that the branding iron could belong to any RC. Harlan let him talk. Ruth Aldridge let him talk. Then Ruth said, Counselor, can you explain to me why an 8-year-old child's drawing of the brand variation matches the iron your client's initials are on? Garrett said that the child was unreliable and too young. Ruth looked at him over her glasses. She's 8, not blind, and she doesn't have a stake in the outcome, which puts her ahead of most of the people in this room. Foster Crane said, the LLC account paid for the fence materials. That's a financial record. I've looked at financial records for 30 years. That account is connected to Roland Cross in a way that is not incidental. When they got to Sheridan, Evelyn spoke before the board had to ask her. Mr. Boone had a dispute with a business partner in Sheridan, she said. He was fined for disorderly conduct, no further legal record. He brought me the first piece of evidence in this case without being asked, without knowing what it meant, without any personal stake in this valley. She looked at the board. I'll take a man who tells me the shape of his past over one who conceals it. Nobody responded to that directly, but Harlan wrote something down. Cyrus Dean asked about the branding rack that had burned. She told them. She told them about the cut fence, too. She had no proof that Roland had ordered either. She said that plainly, because she wasn't going to overreach when she didn't need to. But she put it in the record, and she watched the board members absorb the timeline. These things happened after she hired Elias, after the first cedar chip appeared in the days when Roland was escalating. Walt's notebook went into evidence. Lark's drawings went into evidence. Harlan held the canyon sketch for a long time before he passed it to Vic Hollis. Roland spoke once, near the end, against his attorney's advice. He said the valley needed strong stewardship and that he had only ever been trying to protect Thomas's legacy. Evelyn didn't respond to that. She didn't trust herself to respond to it without saying something she'd regret. Ruth Aldridge responded instead. Mr. Cross, she said, if you were protecting Thomas's legacy, you'd have done it without a padlock on a canyon gate. Roland sat down. The board deliberated for 40 minutes. Evelyn sat in the hallway outside with May on one side and Elias on the other, and Lark on the bench across from them, drawing in her notebook with a focus that suggested she'd moved on to something else entirely and found the waiting less difficult than the adults did. Curtis sat further down the hall with his hat on his knee, as he'd done in the canyon, as he'd been doing for 26 years on hard days, sort present, quiet, not requiring anything. May said, "Stop looking at the door." "I'm not looking at the door." "You looked at it 4 times in the last 2 minutes." Evelyn looked at the window instead. The afternoon light was long and thin, the October light that made everything in the valley look like a photograph of itself. She thought about Thomas. She thought about him teaching her water rights at the kitchen table, and about the brand his grandfather had made, and about the cedar chips with that mark carved into the smooth face, scattered on the county road like something the land had been trying to say for a long time. The door opened. Harlan stood in the doorway. He looked at her. "Come in," he said. She stood. May stood beside her. Elias stood on her other side, and she didn't tell him he didn't need to, because he did need to, and she needed him to. They went back in. Harlan waited until everyone was settled. He was a man who understood the weight of what he was about to say and took the time to hold it properly. "The Cross Ranch lease," he said, "is renewed in full. Term of 5 years, standard conditions, under the name of Evelyn Cross as sole operating leaseholder." He looked at her steadily. "The board further finds that the animals held in the East Canyon pasture are Cross Ranch property and are to be returned immediately. The matter of altered brands is referred to the county sheriff for formal investigation." A pause. "Mr. Roland Cross's supplemental claim is denied in its entirety." The room was quiet. Roland was at the table across from her. She made herself look at him because she thought she owed herself that. Not triumph, just the honest accounting of what had happened. He was looking at the table. His attorney was writing something on a legal pad. The careful, calculating face that had pushed through her door without knocking had gone somewhere she couldn't read. She thought, for a single second, about Thomas, about what he'd have said, standing in this room, hearing his name on a lease beside his wife's instead of his. She thought he'd have been quiet about it. Thomas was that way. He'd have been quiet, and he'd have squeezed her hand, and he'd have gone home and checked on the horses. She straightened the papers in front of her. She looked at Harlan and said, "Thank you." Then she looked at Ruth Aldridge and Cyrus Dean and Vic Hollis and Foster Crane, and she said it again because it needed to be said to all of them. Outside in the hall, May hugged her, which May had never done before in 12 years, and Evelyn held on for a moment before she stepped back. Elias was standing a little apart, looking out the window at the parking lot. She went to stand beside him. "Sheridan didn't come up," she said. "It came up." "It didn't land," she said. "That's different." He was quiet. "What will you do now?" she said. "You're contracted through spring after that." "I don't know," he said. And the way he said it, simply, without evasion, made her think he was actually telling the truth, that he genuinely didn't know, that he was a man who had learned not to plan too far in a world that had a habit of rearranging his plans. She nodded. "Spring is a long way off," she said. "We'll see what it looks like from there." Lark appeared between them, looking up at both of them with her level dark eyes, her notebook under her arm. Evelyn looked down at her. "Ready to go home?" The girl looked at her for a moment, then she nodded. The three of them walked out into the long October afternoon, toward the truck, toward the valley, toward the Cross Ranch that was still hers. The drive back to the ranch took 30 minutes, and nobody said much. May followed in her own truck as far as the south turnoff, then honked once and took the fork toward her own property. Evelyn watched her taillights disappear and felt the specific loneliness of a person who has been held up by other people for a long time and is now, suddenly, on their own ground again, not abandoned, just returned to herself. It was a different feeling than the loneliness of the last 11 months. That loneliness had been a hole. This was just quiet. Elias drove. She hadn't asked him to. She'd walked to the truck and he'd gone to the driver's side, and she hadn't said anything because she was tired down to the level where decisions about small things stopped being possible. Lark was between them on the bench seat, asleep before they cleared the town limits, her head finding Evelyn's shoulder with the unself-conscious directness of a child who has decided, without making a ceremony of it, that a person can be trusted. Evelyn didn't move. She sat with the child's weight against her arm and watched the valley come back into view as they climbed the county road. The hills, the fence lines, the water tower at the Kellerman place, and then the Cross Ranch gate with its weathered post and the brand mark Thomas's father had hung there in 1931. She'd driven through that gate so many times she'd stopped seeing it. She saw it now. Curtis and Pell were in the yard when they pulled in, which meant word had reached them somehow. Probably May had telephoned from the hardware store before she left town, because May thought ahead that way. Curtis had his hat in his hands again, but this time it wasn't the bad news posture. It was something else. He looked at her when she got out of the truck, and he said, "Well?" "5 years," she said. "Full renewal." He put his hat back on. Didn't say anything else. Didn't need to. He turned and went back to the barn, and she could see from the set of his shoulders that he was holding something in, the same thing she was holding in. Not celebration exactly, but the feeling of ground under your feet after a long time of not being sure it was there. Pell said, That's really good, Mrs. Cross." And his face did the thing young faces do when they feel more than they know how to say, going pink at the edges, and she thanked him and sent him to check the East Canyon gate because she needed him to have something to do, and she needed the canyon checked before dark. She went inside. The kitchen table still had her documents on it, the stacks she'd built over 2 weeks, brand records and maintenance logs and survey notes. She stood and looked at them for a moment. Then she picked up the 2 cedar chips in their cotton cloth and held them. She'd been thinking about what to do with them. They were evidence, technically. The sheriff's office would want documentation, and Walt had already noted them in the formal record. But at some point the investigation would close and the chips would come back to her, and she'd been thinking about what a person does with the objects that mark a turning point. Whether you keep them, or put them somewhere, or let them go. She set them back on the table and went to make supper. The sheriff came the next morning, not the man himself, but a deputy named Arland who was maybe 35 and had the careful, unhurried manner of someone who'd learned that arriving fast didn't usually help. He sat at her kitchen table and took her statement and looked at her documentation and asked the same questions twice in different order, the way they do when they're checking whether the answers stay the same. They did. She'd been telling the truth, which had the advantage of being consistent without effort. "Dale Muir came in voluntarily this morning," Arlen told her. "Before we got to him." She looked at him. "He gave a full account. The gate, the transport of the calves, the branding set up in the canyon. He's cooperating." The deputy paused. He says he didn't know about the lease fraud angle, that Roland told him the LLC owned grazing rights to the canyon section. Do you believe him? Arlen considered that with the honesty of a man who had learned not to be careless with certainty. I believe he knew something was off and chose not to look hard. Whether that's criminal or just cowardly, that's for someone else to decide. She nodded. She understood the distinction. She'd met enough men who lived in the space between those two things to know it was real. What happens to Roland? She said. Brand fraud is a felony in this state. Theft of livestock. The LLC is being examined for fraudulent filings. He closed his notebook. What happens to Roland is up to the prosecutor. But Mrs. Cross, what you brought to that hearing was thorough. I've seen cases with less go further. After he left, she sat for a while with her coffee going cold. She thought about Roland in the courthouse, the way he'd looked at the table when Harlan read the decision. She'd spent months being afraid of him, and then she'd spent weeks being angry. And now she felt something she hadn't expected, a tired kind of pity, the feeling you get when you see clearly what a person chose to be and understand that the choosing itself was the punishment. Roland Cross had spent a year engineering the theft of his dead brother's ranch from his dead brother's wife, and he'd done it carefully, with patience and planning and the kind of cold intelligence that could have been directed at anything. He could have built something. He'd chosen instead to take something, and the taking had cost him everything. His reputation, his freedom, his standing in a valley where reputation and standing were the only currencies that mattered long term. She didn't feel sorry for him. Not the way you feel sorry for people who've been unlucky. He'd made choices. But she understood, in a way she couldn't have a year ago, that people who try to steal what someone else has built are usually people who don't believe they can build it themselves. And that was its own kind of poverty, separate from anything the law would do to him. She poured the cold coffee out and made fresh. The first real task of the week after the hearing was the branding rack. She'd been putting it off, not consciously, but the rack had burned, and there'd been the hearing and the canyon and the board, and the ruin of it had been sitting behind the barn like something she didn't have room to look at yet. Now she walked back there on a Thursday morning with her coffee and stood looking at it. The iron fittings were still good. The upright supports had burned through at the base, but the iron rings and the crossbars were solid. What she needed was new lumber, new posts, new assembly. A full day's work for two people, maybe 2 days if she wanted to do it right. Elias appeared beside her. He did that. Arrived without announcement, not sneaking, just not making noise, the way a man does when he's been in quiet places long enough that quiet becomes his natural register. He looked at the rack. Cedar, he said, for the posts, holds up better against the weather and the heat. She almost laughed. After everything, after the burned chip and the canyon gate and the Fremont River receipt, cedar. Not from Fremont River lumber, she said. He looked at her, the almost smile at the edges again. No, there's a mill up by the canyon road. Walt Odom mentioned it. You talked to Walt? He stopped by yesterday, wanted to return the cotton cloth you'd wrapped the chips in. He paused. We talked a while. She looked at him sideways. Elias Boone talking to Walt Odom while she was in the house writing her statement for the deputy. Building acquaintances in the valley the same way he built everything, silent, quietly, without announcement, one careful act at a time. Order what we need, she said. I'll split the work with you. You don't have to do that. I know I don't have to. She drank her coffee. This rack has been here since 1931. I want to know how to build the next one myself. He ordered the cedar that afternoon. It arrived Friday, and they spent Saturday building. Not without difficulty, because Evelyn hadn't done this kind of construction before, and her measurements were off the first time, and they had to recut one of the uprights, which cost an hour and produced a silence between them that wasn't angry, just the silence of two people recalibrating. She appreciated that he didn't smooth over the mistake, or tell her it was fine when it wasn't. He just said, we cut it again, and they cut it again. By late afternoon, the rack was standing. It wasn't as fine as the original type. The original had 30 years of settling into itself the way well-made things do. But it was solid, and it was true, and she'd put her own hands on every joint. She stood back and looked at it. Thomas would have said it needs another coat of sealant, she said. He'd have been right. We'll do it tomorrow. Lark came around the corner of the barn then, as she often did, appearing at the edges of things, drawn by activity or by the particular quality of attention that gathered when something was being made. She looked at the rack with her serious eyes, and then she walked up to the nearest upright and put her hand flat on the cedar. Evelyn watched her. The girl stood there for a moment with her palm on the post, feeling whatever she was feeling. The wood, the work, the fact of a thing standing where a ruin had been. Then she took her hand down and looked at Evelyn and gave a single nod. Small, deliberate. The nod of a person who has evaluated something and found it acceptable. Evelyn felt that nod somewhere deeper than she expected. The calves came home from the canyon on the following Monday, driven by Curtis and Pell, with Elias riding flank. 31 of them back in the south pasture where they belonged, and 9 younger ones in the near pen until they were old enough for the open range. She stood at the fence and watched them come through, and she counted them as they passed, the same way she counted everything on this ranch, out of habit and out of the need to know what she had. 31. 31 animals that had been hidden and were now found, that had worn a false mark and now wore the right one. She'd had Walt document the rebranding, the removal of Roland's mark, and the reapplication of the Cross brand, performed in front of a notarized witness, everything in the record. She was not going to have a question about these animals for as long as she ran this ranch. Roy Pruitt came to see her that week. Helen's husband, the man whose property shared the north drainage, whose wife had been talking in the hardware store about the strange man in Evelyn's bunkhouse. He came alone, without calling ahead, which she'd learned was the Pruitt way of acknowledging that a phone call gave the other person too much time to prepare a response. She met him in the yard. She didn't invite him in. He stood with his hat in his hand, different from Curtis. With Curtis, it was habit and respect. With Roy, it was the hat of a man who knew he'd done something and was using the hat as a small penance. And he said, "I heard about the hearing and the canyon. Word gets around. I want you to know that I didn't. Helen didn't." He stopped, started again. "We weren't trying to cause you harm, Evelyn. We were just careful," she said. He looked at her. "You were being careful," she said. I understand it. Roland had more standing than me, and you share a drainage with this property, and you couldn't afford to make an enemy of whoever ended up running it. That's a practical calculation." She kept her voice even, because she'd decided she wasn't going to be cruel about this, even though part of her wanted to be. "It's not the same as standing beside me. But I understand why you didn't." Roy Pruitt was quiet for a moment. "You're more generous than I'd be." "I'm not being generous. I'm being accurate." She looked at him. "I need to know that the north drainage is managed honestly between us going forward. That's what I need from you, Roy. Not an apology. The water sharing has always been done on a handshake with this property, and I need to know if that's still the case." He looked at her, at the woman who'd been Thomas Cross's wife and who had become, in the span of a season, something the valley hadn't had a name for yet and was still working out. A woman who'd stood in a canyon alone against his brother-in-law and won, and who was now standing in her own yard negotiating water rights with the directness of someone who had learned that directness was the only thing that actually held. "The handshake stands," he said. "Good," she nodded. "Tell Helen I don't hold it against her, but tell her I know." He drove out, and she stood in the yard for a while after. She thought about what she'd said. "I'm not being generous, I'm being accurate," and whether it was true. She thought it mostly was. There was a version of anger in her that would have liked Roy Pruitt to feel worse than he did, that wanted to make the cost of his silence visible to him. But that anger was the kind that turns back on itself, that asks you to spend energy making other people feel bad instead of spending it on your own ground. And she'd been on this ranch long enough to know that energy spent on your own ground was the only kind that compounded. Beverly Kellerman sent a letter, a written letter, not a note, 3 pages in careful handwriting that went through an accounting of why she'd said what she'd said in the hardware store. Not quite an apology, more an explanation that was reaching toward one, the way some people can only approach the thing they owe through the door of justification. Evelyn read it twice, then put it in the stove. Not in anger, in completion. The letter had served its purpose. Beverly needed to write it. Evelyn had read it. That was enough. Roland was formally charged in November. Brand fraud, theft of livestock, fraudulent business filings. The charges were enough to ensure he'd be in legal proceedings for the better part of a year at minimum, and the LLC was dissolved by court order pending the investigation. His attorney from Billings was still on the case, but two of the men who'd been aligned with him in the valley, men who'd attended the same board meetings and deferred to his opinions and gone quiet when they should have spoken, those men had quietly repositioned themselves the way people do when a powerful person loses power. They didn't become Evelyn's allies, they just stopped being obstacles. In a valley this size, that was almost the same thing. She didn't follow the legal proceedings closely. She had a ranch to run. The winter was hard in the way that valley winters are hard. Not dramatically, not with the sudden violence of a blizzard, but with the accumulating weight of cold and mud and shortened days, and the daily arithmetic of keeping animals alive when the temperature didn't climb above 20. She was short money, shorter than she'd been even in the spring, because the legal process had cost her. Not in attorney's fees, she'd avoided those, but in the time and attention she hadn't been able to spend on the ranch itself. And time on a ranch always costs something somewhere. She sat with the books in December and looked at the numbers honestly, which was the only way she knew how to look at them. And she made a list of what she could cut and what she couldn't. And what she could cut was less than what she needed to cut, which meant she was going to have to sell the 2 older horses in spring and delay the south fence repair another season and have a very direct conversation with the feed supplier about extended terms. She had the conversation. The feed supplier, a man named Gus Freeling's brother-in-law, out of Lander, said yes to the extended terms. He'd heard about the hearing. Most people in a 3-county radius had heard about the hearing by now, which was uncomfortable in some ways and useful in others. Being known as the widow who'd beaten Evelyn Cross in front of the full lease board didn't open every door, but it opened enough. Elias stayed through winter without discussion. His contract ran through spring, and he honored it the way he seemed to honor everything. Not with enthusiasm, not with resentment, just with presence and consistency and the daily competence of a man who understood that the work in front of you was the only work that mattered. He fixed the water tank valve she'd been looking at since September. He replaced the rotted sill on the barn's east wall. He built a second gate for the near pen without being asked, because he'd looked at the setup and seen that one gate was the kind of thing that became a problem in an emergency. She noticed these things. She filed them away the way she filed everything, not sentimentally, but accurately. Lark began to speak more. Not all at once. It wasn't a sudden change, more like a tide coming in, the water advancing slowly enough that you weren't sure it had moved until you looked back at where it had been. She spoke first to the animals, which Evelyn noticed one morning in January when she heard a small voice in the barn saying something specific and quiet to the roan mare, who was recovered from her abscess and standing in the crosties for her morning brushing. Then she spoke to Curtis, who handled it well, just answered her as if she'd always talked, which was exactly right. Then she spoke to Pell, who was so transparently delighted that Lark looked at him with the expression of someone recalibrating their opinion of enthusiasm. She spoke to Evelyn in February. It was evening, cold enough that the windows had iced at the edges, and Lark had come inside for something and ended up at the kitchen table with her notebook while Evelyn worked on the accounts. They'd been in the same room for an hour, in the comfortable quiet that had become normal between them, when Lark looked up from her notebook and said, without preamble, "Is this going to be where we stay?" Evelyn stopped writing. She looked at the girl, at the dark, careful eyes and the notebook and the 8 years of watching the world and deciding very precisely when it was worth speaking to. "I don't know," Evelyn said honestly. "That depends on your father." Lark looked at her for a moment. "He likes it here." "Has he said that?" "He doesn't say things like that." The girl turned back to her notebook. "But I can tell." Evelyn looked at her for a while longer. Then she went back to the accounts. She thought about what Lark had said for the next several weeks, turning it over the way you turn over a thing you're not ready to examine directly but can't quite put down. She wasn't a woman who spent much time on what-ifs. She had a ranch and a lease and 31 calves and a water tank that needed its second valve replaced by April, and these were the things that organized her attention. But the question of Elias Boone and what came after his contract ended in spring had been sitting at the edge of her thoughts since the courthouse, since the drive home when Lark had slept against her shoulder, and Elias had kept his eyes on the road, and she'd asked, "What will you do?" And he'd said, "I don't know," with the honesty of a man who genuinely didn't. She didn't try to answer the question for him. It wasn't her question to answer. But in March, when the ground was starting to soften, and the first green was showing in the low pasture, and the ranch had the particular feeling of having survived winter and not being quite sure yet what spring was going to ask of it, Elias knocked on the kitchen door one evening after supper. He came in and sat at the table, the first time he'd sat at the table without being specifically invited, and put his hat down and looked at her. "My contract ends in 5 weeks," he said. "I know when your contract ends. I want to talk about what comes after." She waited. "There are a few ways I could say this," he said, "and I've been trying to work out which one is honest without being more than you want to hear. So I'm going to say it plain, and you can tell me how you want to handle it." "Go ahead." "I'd like to stay on. Not just as a hand. I can find handwork anywhere. I'm talking about something with more stake in it, a formal arrangement. I'd put in labor and time against an ownership share, over however long you want to set the terms, reviewed annually so you can end it anytime it's not working." He paused. "And separately, not connected to the work, not contingent on it, not something you need to answer now or ever if you don't want to. I'd like to court you. When you're ready, if you ever are." The kitchen was very quiet. She looked at him. At the mended coat hanging on the chair back and the hat on the table and the hands that had built her a branding rack and poulticed her mare's abscess and stood without stepping back in a canyon when Roland Cross had come through the gate with 2 men behind him. "You said not connected to the work," she said. "Yes." "You mean that?" "I mean it." His voice was flat and certain. "If you want a partner for the ranch and not anything else, I'll work the arrangement and there won't be any grievance. If you want neither, I'll finish the contract and go." She thought about Thomas, which she did less than she used to and more precisely when she did. Not as a wound, not anymore, but as a measurement. Thomas had been a deliberate man, careful with his words, slow to say things he wasn't sure of. He'd have looked at Elias Boone and recognized the type. He'd have said, "That one doesn't promise what he can't keep." "The work arrangement," she said. "I'd need to see terms on paper. Walt Odom would need to look at them." "That's fair." "Annual review, like you said. Full accounting, shared access to the books." "Agreed. And the other thing?" She looked at him steadily. "I'm not ready for the other thing. I don't know when I will be, or if I will be. I won't pretend I don't know I won't pretend I don't know what you're asking, but I can't give you an answer that I don't have." "I'm not asking for an answer," he said. "I'm asking for the chance to earn one. That's different." She sat with that. It was different. She knew it was different. A man who wanted an answer would have pushed for one. A man who asked to earn one was asking to stay in the present tense, to prove something through time rather than through words, which was exactly how she ran her ranch, not on promises, but on the daily record of what got done. "I'll talk to Walt about the work arrangement," she said. He picked up his hat. "All right." "Elias." He stopped. "What Lark said, about this being where you stay. I heard her say it. I want you to know I heard it." He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, and his face did something she hadn't seen it do before. Not the almost smile at the edges, but something fuller and less controlled, there for a second, before he put it away. He nodded once. Then he went back out to the bunkhouse. She sat at the table for a long time after, in the kitchen where Thomas had taught her water rights, and where she'd spread the lease papers the night Roland walked through without knocking, where she'd written by lamplight after everyone was asleep, and worked through what she had and what she needed, and how far it was from one to the other. The cedar chips were still on the table. She'd put them in a small tin box, not a display, just a container, the same way she kept the brand registration documents and the lease renewal and the survey notes, all the paper evidence of what this place was and who it belonged to. She picked up the tin box and held it. The things that had saved the ranch weren't dramatic things, in the end. They were small things. A piece of wood on a road. A child with a pencil. A neighbor who arrived 10 minutes early in the dark. A man who said, "I'd rather not say," with his eyes level, and then said everything else straight. A deputy who showed up the day after the hearing, not the morning after, but the day after, because he was the kind of man who understood that some things needed a night to settle before anyone was ready to document them honestly. And under all of it, work. The daily, unremarkable labor of maintaining a thing that could easily fall apart if you stopped paying attention. The water tank and the fence and the cattle count and the branding rack rebuilt from new cedar and the accounts that never balanced as cleanly as you wanted but told the truth about where you were. Thomas had said, "You don't fight a man by arguing with him. You fight him by showing people what he is." But there was something before that, something she'd had to learn herself because Thomas hadn't known she'd need it. You don't win by being better than the person trying to take from you. You win by knowing what you have well enough that they can't make you doubt it. By knowing your own land, your own brand, your own record. By having that knowledge so thoroughly in your hands and your head that no amount of rebranding or padlocking or reputation work can make you lose track of what's real. Roland had counted on her doubting herself. He'd counted on the weight of the valley's skepticism, on the hands who left and the neighbors who went quiet and the board member who moved the hearing up 2 weeks. He'd counted on all of that eroding something in her that would make her give up before she found the canyon gate. What he hadn't counted on was that Thomas had spent his last good months teaching her. What he hadn't counted on was May Dunbar arriving 10 minutes early in the dark. What he hadn't counted on was a child who noticed the color red and pointed east. What he hadn't counted on, and this was the thing she kept coming back to, was that a woman who has already survived the worst year of her life is not afraid of a man who smiles with his mouth while his eyes stay busy. She put the tin box back on the table. She looked around the kitchen, the documents, the lamp, the coffee pot, the window with the yard beyond it, and the barn and the new branding rack standing solid in the dark. Hers, not by inheritance, not by law alone, by work and attention, and the willingness to stay when staying was the harder thing. Spring came the way it always did in that valley. Not gently, but with the kind of force that felt like impatience, like the land had been holding something back for months and finally let it go. The low pasture flooded and drained and came up green in less than a week. The roan mare foaled in late April, a dark filly who stood within the hour and looked around with the suspicious alertness of someone who had arrived in a place they hadn't asked to be and intended to evaluate it before committing. Evelyn stood in the stall and watched her and thought, yes, that's about right. Lark named her Chalk for the mark on the canyon gate that had held through the night. She said it clearly, out loud, in front of Evelyn and Elias and Curtis said, "Good name," and Pell said, "That's a great name." And Elias looked at his daughter with the expression he kept in reserve for the moments when she chose to speak, a full and unguarded pride. The look of a man who has not always been able to give a child what a child deserves, and knows it, and is trying, daily, to close the distance. The partnership agreement went to Walt Odom in April, and came back with 2 suggested revisions, both of which Evelyn accepted because they were reasonable, and Walt was a careful man who didn't suggest things without reason. She and Elias signed it at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning with Curtis as witness, nobody making a ceremony of it, which was exactly how it should have been. Work was work. It started with showing up, and it continued with doing it. She did not know, in April, what the other thing would become. She suspected she was a woman who paid attention, and attention led to suspicion, and suspicion on a ranch was usually right. But she didn't know yet, and she was comfortable not knowing. Comfort with not knowing was something she'd had to learn the hard way, in the months after Thomas died, when the future had felt like a wall she couldn't see around, and she'd had to stop looking at the wall and look at what was in front of her instead. What was in front of her was a ranch, a lease renewed for 5 years, 31 calves in the south pasture wearing the right brand, a new branding rack and a repaired water tank, and a filly named Chalk who was already developing opinions about everything. A man who had said, "I'm asking to earn it," and showed up the next morning and did the work, the same as the morning before, without requiring acknowledgement for any of it. A girl with dark, careful eyes who had decided, somewhere along the way, that this was where she stayed, and who expressed that decision not in words but by learning the names of every animal on the property, and by leaving her notebook on the kitchen table instead of the bunkhouse, by small degrees, until one day it simply lived there. The valley hadn't become easy. Easy wasn't available in the Lander Valley, possibly hadn't ever been. The neighbors who'd gone quiet mostly came back around, not with apologies, but with the ordinary resumption of ordinary things. A nod at the feed store, a hand raised from a passing truck, Roy Pruitt making sure the drainage management held clean. Beverly Kellerman sent a pie in May, which Evelyn accepted and shared with the hands without commentary. Some things you didn't need to speak in order to close. Harlan Pruitt stopped by in June, on his way past, which she suspected was not entirely accidental, but was offered as though it were. He stood in the yard and looked at the property, at the fence lines and the branding rack and the well-maintained look of a place that was being worked correctly. And he said, "Things look good out here, Evelyn." "Things are good," she said. He nodded. He started to leave, then stopped. "That girl, Lark, she going to school in the fall?" "Starting September." "Good." He put his hat back on. "She sees things, that one." "Yes," Evelyn said, "she does." After he left, she stood in the yard for a while in the June light, the long, warm light that made the valley look like it was lit from inside, and she thought about what it meant to have a name that was yours again. Not Thomas Cross's widow, not the woman trying to hold on, not the person Roland had written his story about. Incompetent, grieving, ripe for management. Her own name, on her own lease, on her own land. Evelyn Cross. Sole operating leaseholder. Owner and manager of the Cross Ranch, 412 acres in the Lander Valley, leased in good standing with the county board, documented and recorded and hers by every measure that mattered. She went back inside and got back to work. That was the thing nobody told you about winning something you'd nearly lost. The winning didn't change the work. The fence still needed checking. The books still needed balancing. The animals still needed tending, and the water still needed managing, and the daily 1,000 small acts of keeping a working ranch alive didn't pause to acknowledge that you'd been to a courthouse and come home with your name intact. They just waited for you to come back and pick them up again. She picked them up again. Every morning. That was the whole of it. And it was enough. More than enough, it was everything.